Huge shout out to our sponsor, Glassdoor, who made this webinar possible. I know everyone's going to learn a lot today, and they did a great job of pulling together all of this information. You can check out more about their employer-facing services at glassdoor.com/employers. And last note, if you're on Twitter, you can follow the conversation. All of our information is in the bottom of each and every slide. So you have at GD for employers, that's the Glassdoor handle, at Greenhouse. Of course, at Recruiting Blogs will be live tweeting, and we'll be using hashtag GDChat. Now I will let our presenters take it from here.
Hi, I'm Kirsten Davidson. I'm head of employer brand at Glassdoor. And here at Glassdoor, I have kind of a 50-50 split. One is 50% of my time is spent helping to build Glassdoor's employer brand. So I always share that to let the folks know that I sit and struggle with the exact same things you do. And then the other half of my job are great things like this, where I get to share out some best practices and what we're learning.
And I am Lauren Ryan. I am the Director of Talent Acquisition at Greenhouse. I'd say my role mirrors Kirsten's in many ways, in that I actually run our recruiting team that is helping grow Greenhouse as a company and hire new people for Greenhouse. And then I also spend a lot of time working with our customers and other heads of talent acquisition to understand what kind of challenges they're facing and work together with them and our product to help kind of solve those.
All right, before we get started, we have a quick poll that we want everyone to take. And how are you currently using analytics at your company? So we'll give you just a moment here to make a choice. It helps us understand and make sure we're delivering the right content. All right. Hopefully that was enough time. Okay, so the U.S. employer spends about $4,000 in 52 days to hire a single worker. Now, in the last economic jobs report, we saw that unemployment was also down 4.7, and in places like Denver, you even see unemployment at about 3%, and open jobs are at a high of 5.8 million. It's more important than ever that companies and HR teams are really figuring out how to be more strategic with their communications, differentiated. How do you stand out when there's fewer people looking for more jobs and there's more competition? And then how do you get your employees and your communities to be engaged? Talent analytics is a huge part of that. So this is why we're here today. Now, the discipline of talent analytics has become hugely important for HR and business leaders. I think it's really important to think about HR is really moving out of the HR department and into the leadership teams. The insights that HR has where they're having trouble hiring often mirrors where the company is maybe having trouble internally. So you might find that in the engineering department, it's really, really hard to hire the right people. Being able to take a look at what's going on in engineering, helping them plan better, helping them set their budgets as you set your budgets accordingly is more important than ever. We're also seeing kind of a trend of marketing really caring a lot about the employee experience, about how they promote that. And the insights that they need really come all from talent analytics. So it's using data wisely. And then in terms of HR, it's how do you make really accurate hiring projections? Investment in more profitable recruiting channels. And then ultimately, it's hiring the right people, making sure they stay. So it's important to know, follow, and then really study the numbers. So I'm going to share with you a couple ways to really apply talent analytics throughout your organization. And this is as you're putting together your plans, your programs, how to be really strategic about this data and applying it to making a powerful difference. And then our friends at Greenhouse are going to share some very transparent data that they have about the programs that they've built specifically. So our goal today is really to have you be able to take away some practical tips that you can apply internally to make a big difference. So number one, using talent analytics to do better forecasting and setting budgets. Talent analytics not only helps you forecast, but it helps you meet your hiring goals. So you really can look at how you are allocating your spending among people, systems, programs. So as you watch the numbers, what are the platforms that are most helpful for you? How do you plan, organize, track budgets throughout the year? So that's more of a process question. And then how do you report that back to the outside teams that need that information to make their own decisions? And then how do you plan and identify budgets for new tools to help you reach your goals? So again, it's not just having the analytics. I often think that we might even need fewer data points than we have today. It's how we use that and how do we get insights from that to apply so we can make a difference in the programs that we have. So using talent analytics also helps you figure out and define what the gaps you have are, and then building supporting programs to strengthen your current activities. So the first one we see companies really starting to put some money against is beefing up their employee referral programs. At many companies, the employee referral program is often one of the most successful ways that companies hire. It's the highest quality of candidate that comes in, and it's the fewest per hire, so companies make those hires fast and they spend a lot less money on them. So figuring out how to engage your employees and putting programs against that, hugely successful, especially in the harder to fill roles. So mobile recruiting, no surprise here, prospective employees are coming in through mobile. So what is your process? How do you make that even easier, especially for technology companies or companies who need to really seem like they're on the cutting edge? This is the first access that people have to you, and getting this right is very important. Employer branding is a big piece of talent analytics. So really understanding the makeup of the people who are coming in, even developing personas. It's not one message fits all. What engineers need, what sales need, what appeals to different people in the different organizations that you have makes a difference. Even monitoring, looking at your job descriptions and figuring out how to really pull out messaging that applies. A lot of that data of how you need to do that and how you can refine lives in your talent analytics. And then lastly, really importantly, beefing up diversity initiatives as companies focus more and more on the value of having a diverse employee group. We have to get smart about how we reach out to new groups, new organizations to help bring in better talent. Another way to use talent analytics is to put your own people through the process. So if you haven't recently, either yourself or some members of your team, have them actually go out and test your own process. There's also a lot you can learn through places like Glassdoor, looking at interview reviews that people have. What can you learn from it? How do you amplify the stuff that's already working? And then how do you really address areas where you have problems? So what channels are people using to research you? What would you research to find yourself? How do you show up in the searches? How do you show up in terms of how you differentiate in your messaging? And then what is the actual application process like? What is it like on desktop, mobile? Go through the interview process. One of the best ways you can figure out how to really improve is use those analytics then and put them all to the test and make a difference. And then we talked a little bit about employer branding, but being really smart about how to refine your message. The market is changing fast. There's new people all the time, new competition. Again, the competition is getting harder. So how do you really differentiate? How do you differentiate in your messaging out? How do you differentiate to employees to make sure you have the retention that you need and then other people aren't leaving? And then I think it's really important, we a lot of times focus on our weaknesses and always trying to figure out how to get better and fix the things we have. That can often be a big boat to turn, and not that it's not important, we don't need to focus there, but also a really quick way to get to the top in terms of what you're doing and who you're trying to reach is really also analyze where you have strengths. What are you doing really well? How do you do more of that? And then lastly, here's how do you develop a reporting timeline? I think this is really key in terms of talent analytics. It's not just having the analytics within your team, but making sure you're socializing that out with your business partners. Again, this data is hugely valuable to marketing, it's hugely valuable to sales, and it's incredibly important for the executive leadership team to understand what talent is saying, what your employees are saying, how is that affecting the morale, how is culture being communicated out, and establishing regular timelines for reporting this data. So here's what we're going to report. Here's how it aligns with the overall business objectives of the organization. Here's how often you're going to get it, so they know what to expect, and your talent analytics are really being put to use throughout the whole organization. So as we get started, one of the first most important, I think, objectives and actions that you can take is understanding and aligning what you're doing with the overall business objectives of the company, making sure you're putting the right money into the right places. They're going to get the right impact in terms of priorities for the whole organization. And a key part of that is the KPIs, so your key performance indicators that you set up right at the top. Make sure there's buy-in from the leadership across the board, and that your talent analytics is aligning to that to help drive HR as a really strategic initiative. And I'm now going to turn it over to Lauren over at Glassdoor, who's going to take us through how they have used KPIs and talent analytics and share their deep processes and some pretty interesting things that they're doing. And hopefully you'll be able to take away some practical application for yourself as well.
Thanks, Kirsten. Yep, I'm here. Thank you. Hey, everyone. I am Lauren. As a reminder, Director of Recruiting at Greenhouse. And so Kirsten just walked us through a lot of really great metrics across a lot of different kind of buckets of business that talent analytics can help us understand, things like talent branding, our recruiting process, how we're being perceived in the market, what our candidates are thinking about us. I'm going to dive in kind of specifically on how we have thought about recruiting KPIs. So to start, let's zoom out just a smidge. A KPI is a key performance indicator. Now what that means is there's actually a lot kind of loaded into those three words, and it helps you pick what metrics make sense as a KPI. So when you're thinking about what should be your KPI, what you want to make sure to test it against first is that it is key. It's important. It's the top handful of things you need to know about whatever topic you're diving into. It's performance related, which means it gives you information about results or outcomes. It's not an aggregation of activity. And then finally, most importantly, I think, is that it's meant to be an indicator. It is a signal of how an overarching process is performing. It gives you headline information about the general trend, right? Like overall, our recruiting process is going well or it's slowing down, and then it acts as a signal for telling you when you need to dig in deeper and get more information about how to course correct or not, that things are going great and you can just kind of move on. So when Greenhouse was starting to think about recruiting KPIs, we were thinking about it both for ourselves as a recruiting team, but more importantly for our customers. We work with a lot of customers at a lot of different types of companies with differently structured recruiting teams, but we were hearing across the board they wanted some help thinking about metrics, and we're curious about what other recruiting teams in other companies were doing. So we realized that there was a way to help kind of aggregate this information about what everyone was doing and what really smart talent leaders were thinking, and help start to create a standard. When we were having these conversations, we noticed that these KPIs align really well to the concept of a funnel. And that should make a lot of sense if you are close to any of your counterparts in sales or marketing. They think about their process as a funnel as well, where you start with a really broad pool of people, leads, or deals that may or may not be qualified, and then you start to move them through, qualify them throughout the process, and ultimately end up with a much smaller handful. And their KPIs match to different parts of that process. So the recruiting KPIs actually did the same thing. And what we wanted to do was find a KPI that attached to different pieces of this funnel. So I'm going to run you through the 5 KPIs that we used, and we have a lot more information. You can go into these in more depth at any other time, but I wanted to give you a kind of 1,000-picture view of what these metrics are. So when we're thinking about sourcing, the top of funnel, very broad bucket of candidates that may or may not be qualified, what we realize that we actually want to measure is the number of qualified candidates that we have at any given time. So a qualified candidate for us means it's someone that has passed the first milestone in our process, which is a application review, and they're qualified to have a phone screen with a recruiter, which means they meet the basic requirements of the job, they look right on paper, and now we'll continue to assess them further. It's been an important metric for us because it's a leading indicator of how the rest of the pipeline is going to go. After you've run, similar roles and analyzed the pipeline a handful of times, there are patterns that emerge. And for different types of roles, you start to understand, for this role, I need 18 QCs to predict a hire, and for these more difficult roles, I might need 28 to predict a hire. And so you can know if you're on track or not. So that's the early stage sourcing metric. Now we're moving into the interviewing process, which is, I think, the bread and butter for many recruiters when we think about the actual process that we're running every day. And we thought about KPIs as wanting to hit 2 sides of the coin. On one side, quality of process, and on the other, effectiveness or speed of process. So to hit both of those, we ended up with 2 metrics. One is answering the question of efficiency, and the way we measure that is source to close days, in days. So how many days pass between when the candidate that ultimately is hired applied? How long did it take you to move them through the interview process? And then when we think about quality, we're relying on our customers, our candidates, to let us know how the process went through candidate survey results, as they are our ultimate stakeholder. Our goal is to make sure they have a great experience, so they want to sign their offer. So we collect survey results through the product, through Greenhouse. Then the final stage of the process is hiring. It's very short in terms of time, but very impactful in terms of how your team is doing. And so what we think about there are our offer acceptance rate. We've just invested a ton of time in each of these candidates. Are we making sure that when we get to the end of the process and we decide that they're our favorite, they feel the same way about us and want to sign our offer? And then finally, a metric called hires to goal. And that just simply asks, are we hitting our hiring goals, or what percentage of our hiring goals are we hitting? What's implicit in this KPI that can be challenging for some teams, depending on how your org is structured, is that you do need goals. You need to know that in September, our goal was to hire 15 people, and in the quarter, it was to hire 50. And you need to be able to rely on that goal not to change too much throughout the course of the quarter, so that this metric is meaningful and impactful. So taking those 5 and looking at them again across that funnel visually, we start with the number of qualified candidates. We then think about our process in terms of quality and effectiveness with source to close and candidate survey results. And then finally, in the very end of the process, we track our offer acceptance rate and our hires to goal. And as you think about these, you'll realize, like, offer acceptance rate is so far down the pipeline, you won't be able to move it as quickly, which is why tracking all the stuff that comes before it is really critical. Great. Okay. So those are kind of the theory of the 5 KPIs that you would want to track. So the 5 KPIs that I track at Greenhouse. So when I first joined the team mid-2015, we put those in place. We started setting goals against them, tracking them quarter over quarter, working to make improvements. And then the next step for us in terms of talent analytics was using everything we knew about the process now to do workforce planning, and think about how the recruiting team can best support management as they plan the next year's growth. So in the January of this year, I was looking at a board deck and looking at a chart that sales had, and I realized that what we really wanted to do was to cut through what had been really wildly vacillating recruiting requirements in 2015 and be able to accurately plan the year. We had a loose headcount. It had been created by leadership. It was a good stab in the dark, but it was set without any understanding of how the recruiting team would be able to support those goals, or what the capacity was to be able to execute against that. And so it had set us up for some, inconsistent success metrics throughout the year. So I took the idea of a sales chart, and this was very familiar to all of us, right? We have month over month, our VP of sales commits to a certain revenue target, and then at the end of the year, we can look backwards and plot that dark blue line against it and say how close we were on any given month to attaining what our goal had been. We weren't able to do this yet with hiring. The goals weren't set or consistent or realistic enough, but I wanted that level of accuracy. So I thought about if what I wanted was a hiring chart that looked like this on the next slide. What we wanted was to be able to have a sense of what was a realistic commitment for the team and for the business in terms of number of people that we could hire each month, and at the end of the year be able to look backwards and say how well we performed against that. You know, hopefully we would always be above the blue line or not too far under it, but even the ability to produce this chart had eluded us so far. So to be able to do that, we needed goals, and we needed them on a monthly basis. So the first thing we did to be able to set ourselves up to commit in that way was develop a plan for driving realistic headcount goals. The first step, and I'm going to run through these pretty briefly, but I'm happy to answer any questions about them, was understanding the organization's goals and headcount requirements. The reason it's important to start with goals is because if you understand, for example, that engineering headcount requirements are tied to how many users are going to be on the platform, which is tied to how sales do, you'll start to be able to predict how your headcount plan will change as you watch how the business progresses throughout the year. You can proactively have a conversation about needing to adjust headcount in August when sales have been better than expected, rather than wait for the engineering or the sales team to feel some pain of not having enough people and come to you reactively. So go through that process first with each of the heads of each department. Then, and this part's really critical, understand how roles match with the organizational priorities. So a situation we had found ourselves in 2015 was heads of department would come to us asking for a hire, right? Maybe 3 people come to us at the same time, all urgently needing a hire. Recruiting was put into the position of needing to decide whether to make the trade-off between a marketing, an engineering, or a sales hire without true visibility into how making those trade-off decisions were impacting the overall organizational goals. We were kind of just going with like whoever was loudest or whoever we thought we could like have a quick win, like the easier role that we could win quickly and then move on to the next, which wasn't an effective way of making that decision. So we then, once we had the headcount plan from each department head, went back, in our case it was with our CEO, and he helped make the trade-off decisions and the timing decisions so that the plan then didn't just reflect the reality of what the department needed, but what the business needed, taking all those dependencies into account. The next step we'll go into more detail on in the next slide, but what we did was quantify recruiting capacity to support that headcount need. It's one thing to have a headcount plan, but if you don't know if your team is set up to be able to deliver that, you still won't be able to accurately commit to certain hires month over month. So you need to be able to quantify the capacity of your team and match up the needs of the organization. It's very unlikely that those two things will match right from the start. So then number 4 comes into play, where you calibrate the gap between those two models. And then the 5th and 6th step is really communication. You use this model to have a conversation with your department leaders on your team's capacity and make sure you're perfectly aligned on how their requirements for the year match your team's ability to support those requirements for the year. With me, that looks something like having a conversation with marketing and saying, okay, marketing, you have 12% of the headcount requirements for the year. I will aim for you to have 12% of the recruiting capacity for the year, and having a conversation around how to optimize that. So I want to dive into number 3 in more detail, quantifying recruiting capacity to hit the goals that you set. In order to do that, next slide please, you need to model out 2 things. You need to model out which roles your team can fill and when they can fill them by, right? We need to know both quantity and timing to end up with the charts that we want. To be able to do this, you need to understand quantitatively what your team's capacity is. So to do that, what we did is build a points model that weighs roles by difficulty. I think that it's intuitively obvious to us in recruiting that not all roles are created equally for many different reasons. In our business, for example, it's much more difficult to find an engineer than it is to find an entry-level salesperson. It takes a lot more recruiting resources, business resources to bring that engineer in. And so any sort of model we create, we want to reflect that. So we built a point kind of schema. For us, it had elements of, availability in the market, as well as things like how many internal meetings and alignment are necessary for any role. Particularly for new roles, we meet a lot more than we do for roles that we've hired before. So create a list of the things that impact in your organization what makes roles more or less difficult. It'll be different depending on your organization, but that's where you start. And then the next step is figuring out how many points a recruiter can carry every month. So the way we did this was take this points model that we'd aligned on and apply it backwards to historical roles. So we'd been recruiting for a year and a half. We now had this points model. So how can we go backwards and understand what the recruiters have been doing in terms of points and have a conversation with the recruiting team to say, like, what months felt like way too busy and not sustainable, and what months did you feel like, yeah, this is exactly the right level of work for me, and let's start to think about what the average points per recruiter per month looks like. So we did that, and then the final step is once you have that average, you can calculate that out across your team for the year. So you might want to say that a senior recruiter carries a little bit more than a junior recruiter. You can finesse the way the points land on your team. But what you end up with is a number that your team can, in 2016, carry 346 recruiting points for the organization. So then you use that same points rubric to assign out points to the coming year's roles. And what you end up with is an equation that looks something like the recruiting team has 268 points for the year in terms of capacity. The headcount plan has 348 points for the year in terms of business requirements and headcount needs. Those two things don't match. So then we calibrated. Ours did not match on the first go. We were under. The way you calibrate might be different depending on how far off you are. So if you're like that example of 260 points of capacity versus 340 on the team, that's probably 2 whole people that you're missing for the year. And so then that becomes a very quantitative argument about growing your recruiting team and expanding headcount for the recruiting team to be able to help the rest of the organization hit their headcount needs. If you're finding that there's just like a couple of months, for example, where there's a big gap, then it probably doesn't make sense to hire a new recruiter. That's a great place to leverage agencies or even contract recruiters. The point of this is it's not a one-size-fits-all solution for calibrating the gap, but what you end up with is a lot of data and information to make a smart decision about the way to make those two things match each other. Like your ultimate goal is make the number of points on the headcount plan match the number of points on your recruiting team. So then finally, now that we have a hiring plan and we have a team that can hit it, you can use the KPIs that we walked through of, how long it takes for you to typically run through a process and create a model that allows you to accurately commit to the right number of hires every month. And hopefully at the end of this year, and I'll be able to let you know how it goes, look backwards and plot a chart that shows how well your team executed on the promise that you had made to the business.
Great. So before we close, just a quick recap. So leveraging your talent analytics gives you insights in order to make better decisions. So it helps you forecast, really take a look at where you have gaps, and then make sure you're refining your processes along the way so that you can win against your competitors. And then when it comes to KPIs, just following up with what Greenhouse shared, really tracking the most important aspects of your recruiting effort. So number one, the number of qualified candidates, because it's not just all the applications that you get through, right? It's making sure you get the right ones. Days to offer, so how quickly, how smoothly can you get people through the process. Candidate survey results is one of your best places to get data that you need to make better process decisions. And then offer to acceptance rate, so how much does what they expect come through and they get what they're looking for. And then hires against your goals. So making sure that your goals are set accurately at the very beginning so that you're tracking, when you're tracking your hires to goals, you're making sure you're hitting your mark. And with that, we want to open it up to Q&A.
All right, so we have some great questions already in. For anyone else who's on the line, please feel free to share yours now. We have a little bit of time. All right, so you just mentioned candidate surveys. What questions are you asking in your candidate surveys right now?
This is Lauren. So we collect candidate feedback in two different ways. The candidate survey I mentioned is built into Greenhouse. So Greenhouse customers automatically have access to that feature. It asks the high-level question of overall, my interview experience was a positive one. That's the high-level KPI that we track, the percentage of candidates that either agree or strongly agree with that question about having a positive interview experience. The other questions we ask are things like, my interview started on time, the position was clearly explained to me, I was treated with courtesy and respect. We have 8 different questions that we ask candidates, that we ask candidates, and that all of our customers who have the feature turned on ask candidates. And then what's interesting about that too is that you also end up with benchmark information. So you can see how your results compare on average to the rest of Greenhouse customer results and get a sense for, kind of how. Oh.
Lauren, I think there we go. That's you.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you cut out there for a moment, but you're back in.
Oh, okay, sorry about that. Essentially, you can calibrate against another pool of recruiting teams that have the feature turned on to understand what a normal result is or not.
And then this is Kristen from Glassdoor, and I would just share that, obviously one of the most important tools for us is the interview feedback that we get through Glassdoor. And what we see is, so people can say whether or not they accepted the offer, if they got no offer at all, or if they declined. One of the things that we saw, and this is true against what we see from clients kind of across the board, is that the highest level of people who are dissatisfied with the process comes from people who received no offer. And as we dug into that a little bit, where that comes from is not that they went through the process and then got turned down or got no offer. It was way upstream when people were just applying and then never heard back, or had some very initial contact, but someone hadn't closed the loop. And we find that with most of our clients as well. So what we did is, just knowing that little piece, we made some adjustments to our recruiting, the recruiting team, and what they did is we just created a checklist and made sure that when we took a look at the data, that we were learning from it, making sure that we're doing a couple things across the board to just give a clean, valuable experience to people. And so one of those was, for every application we get, we make sure we respond at least in some way, even if it's to say thank you for your resume, we don't have anything that fits at this time, but please stay in touch. And then just the other day, we had a review come in saying, I've put out all these applications. Glassdoor, while I didn't get an interview, was one of the only companies that even got back to me. So there's a lot to be learned there, and we try to collect it a little bit organically. And then what we do is we do a text-based analysis and put that against kind of some key categories that we're measuring and tracking along the way.
Yeah, I'll piggyback on that also. The question I get from people frequently when they're nervous about starting to collect candidate feedback is that they fear that the people that will respond are ones who have had a negative experience. And we have not actually found that to be true. So respondents, plenty of people that did not get an offer respond to the survey, but we still find that on average, Greenhouse and our customers have overall positive ratings on their interview process. So it doesn't seem that it's kind of like a candidate scoring situation. The candidates are providing really objective and helpful feedback about your recruiting process.
Yep, I agree.
And just from an outside perspective, I would say if you're looking for data on candidates, on their experiences, both Greenhouse and Glassdoor have an incredible wealth of information. Subscribe to their blog, follow them on Twitter, see the information that they're putting out there, because that will keep you on top of those latest trends and help you kind of work backwards from the number into solutions. And that's coming, they didn't pay me to say that. I genuinely believe that. I follow all the information because it's really good. All right, so back to the question. So Kate, thank you for your question. She asked, for the points model, did you rank 1 through 5? And her second part of her question is, when deciding to grow your team, what did you decide was the maximum amount of points one person could handle?
So the first part of your question about ranking 1 through 5, I actually did 1 through 3, but for no magic reason. I actually think like it was the first time I had done it. I think when I do it again next year, I might divide the points out a bit more based on things I've learned this year. I think 1 through 5 would work really well. I think what you want to do is start by writing the list of things that impact a role. And figure out the degree to which those things impact the role, and your point system will start to shake itself out. I don't think there's a right or wrong. It depends a lot on your organization. The second question was, how do you decide the max points? Yeah.
So the way I did it is I went backwards through our historical data and applied the new point system to the old roles that we had closed, and looked at, on average, how many points each recruiter was carrying, did some analysis around outliers and took out things that didn't feel relevant. But I made the decision for at least this first run of assuming that we were pretty operationally efficient last year with our historical data. And I felt confident in that because we had been tracking those KPIs and more or less hitting what we set out to do. So I could make that assumption. I think that if that wasn't the case, you might want to look at average and then put in some sort of efficiency buffer, right? Add a little bit more points because you think you could become more efficient. But I think a good place to start is with a historical average, as that'll provide a lot of context setting, and you can always tweak it over time, but at least it's rooted in a reality that you can duplicate.
Awesome, thank you. Lee Ferguson wanted to know, how would a KPI plan differ from a typical organization to a recruitment agency? He said, i.e. agencies manage multiple clients, tougher to predict recs. Do you have any suggestions for them?
You're right. Like they're certainly different, and I would imagine that it's a lot less about the process, the recruiting process, and probably a lot more about sourcing. And that like key things you'll want to track are percentage of. It's almost more of a sales pipeline, like a sales qualifying pipeline. Percentage of people that respond to your inbound requests, percentage of people that you're able to convert to interested based on that phone call that you get on with them. I think that I would start, and I apologize, I've not worked in an agency, so I'm not super familiar with kind of the pieces of the process that would be most right to optimize, but I would start with just mapping your process and understanding where are the key points of conversion or inflection that if something goes wrong there or gets off track there, impacts the rest of the process negatively, and start to track those numbers at those key inflection points.
And I mean, I would add, I think that funnel is probably a good place to start. The funnel where you have the sourcing and hiring, right? Mm-hmm. It's looking at metrics within each of those buckets that are applicable to your agency.
Right. Great point.
All right. So, Steve, thank you. He said, are you doing any scenario workforce planning based on revenue projections? So you can do a little bit of a forecast with hiring.
We did not this year. I think it's a great idea. I can imagine us doing something like that this coming year. This past year was the first time, we had a headcount plan. So we felt very satisfied with it, at least having the list and then matching the recruiting team against it. I think next year things that we do a little bit differently is exactly what you're mentioning, some scenario planning and some probably more sophisticated insertion of expected backfills and attrition. This time we just kind of said a bucket expectation of percentage over the year that would leave and we'd have to backfill because we didn't have any better information than that. But I think that was also missing from the headcount plan this year.
Yeah, I think that's also a great idea and a great question. And like Lauren, I would say for Glassdoor, we haven't implemented that across the board. Where we do it, and this maybe is similar to what a lot of people are doing, is on a smaller basis. So if we have an event where someone's coming through certain teams, we make sure that we have a plan in place. If we have a top candidate come through, are we ready to execute? So how do we make sure for certain candidates, for certain roles, that we're ready to execute, that we have everything in line? So it's not, again, always a one-size-fits-all, but making sure that we're mapping internally to do what we have to do and trying to plan around best practices and kind of best-case scenarios to make sure that we're not losing talent that we need to get right away.
Absolutely. So a question about your offer to acceptance ratio. What is yours, and what do you think a good standard of excellence is?
That's a really good question. I feel like there's a lot of theory that could be baked into it. We aim to be at about between 85 and 90% any quarter, and that's a fully weighted average, which with engineering, which can sometimes be lower, and all of our ops roles, which are often higher. I think the question is sort of like, do you want to go after someone that might be a little bit out of your reach from a budget perspective to still like try and get them and know that you might not, and that's okay, versus trying to like really stick to a certain high number as your offer acceptance rate. So I think there's some kind of strategy and perspective that's baked into everyone's goal offer acceptance rate. I purposely try and keep ours a bit lower so that we can reach for a candidate that might be, a little bit outside of our typical expectation for the role or our reach, and not be afraid of lowering that KPI. Because it is true that whatever you start to measure or set as goals, you start to incentivize your team to behave in a certain way or to strive to reach those goals. So kind of be thoughtful about the edge cases when you set goals and make sure that you're setting them in a way that makes sense for you. And for us, that's what works, is somewhere in the 85 to 90% range. I don't know if that's best practice, though, because I do think it should be based on, your organization and how you do offers. And I mean, I don't think you'd want to see something very low or too much lower than 80, I imagine. But you should just have a conversation with your team and leadership about like, what do we feel comfortable with, and how do we feel comfortable approaching offers that we aren't sure will close.
Yeah, and this is Kirsten. What we look at from an app to hire ratio is actually not app to hire, because we get a lot of applications, but it's really looking at the qualified candidates that come through. And then I'm just scrolling through really quickly, and I can come back to this, but I have a statistic on the industry standard for application to hire. So if you want to move on, and then I'll pipe in when I have that.
Perfect. All right, so I have one more question here. Anyone on the line, if you have more questions, now is the time to share. How are you using this data to give feedback to recruiters on your team?
Yeah, this is Kirsten. I'll go there. So we actually give quite a bit of feedback to our recruiters. We meet monthly, so across all of our sourcing platforms. We look at all the data kind of all the way through. So from a talent analytics perspective, we don't have someone on board who does specifically that. We have a couple of data scientists in the organization. So we've sort of assigned them to look at our data and help us analyze it. And then we pull the insights from that, and as a recruiting team and working together with them, we really think about, okay, what are the most important pieces for us coming up as we look at our goals, and how do we improve that? So do we need to do a different kind of level set that we need to communicate in terms of hire if we're seeing across the board that we're getting less applicants, or we have less jobs that we're actually promoting that quarter or something like that. And then also looking at processes in general, where do we need to improve? How do we make tweaks along the way to make sure that we're hitting the mark? Couldn't
agree more. And on our side, we actually, each each recruiter, depending on the roles that they've been assigned for the coming quarter, also kind of signs up for and commits to the KPI, each of the KPIs for their particular role for the quarter. And so then that becomes part of their goals, it's part of what we track to and talk about in all of our one-on-one meetings. And that becomes part of how they measure their success for the quarter, not just number of hires, but also, their own, like how well they built up their qualified candidate pipelines early in the process, their own offer acceptance rate, candidate survey results, speed, et cetera.
All right. Well, on that note, I want to thank both of our speakers. I really appreciate all the insight and examples you brought to the table today. And thank you to Glassdoor again for making this possible. For everyone who's on the line, yes, you will get a copy of the slides. Yes, you'll get a copy of the recording. We'll have both of these to you within 48 hours. And Glassdoor also has a really awesome new ebook that they'll include with that. So you'll get a little bit of all the information so that you can go about making better data-driven decisions. Thank you so much, and I hope you'll be a part of our next webinars. Thank you,
real quick,
and have a great day.
I just wanted to pipe in with the last piece. So the industry standard for offers to hire is 89%.
Perfect.
And then in terms of applications to interviews is about 12%, right? So you have 12% from application to interview, 89% to offer to hire are the industry numbers.
Very cool. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, and everyone have a great day.
Thanks. Bye-bye.